Hi guys, welcome back to the Curly Reader. Today we're going to talk about all the things I read during the month of April. During the month of April, I read 8 books, 5 of which were audiobooks, 3 of which were print books. The print books that I read were a graphic novel, a book of poems, and a children's Bible. So I did not do a lot of physical reading this month, but I did get 5 audiobooks done, and so I'm calling that a win. So after finishing up middle grade March, I had a really hard time finding something that I wanted to read that was holding my interest. And so the first thing that I ended up reading this month was #IMomSoHard by Kristen Hensley and Jen Smedley. They are a pair of comedians that post funny videos on Facebook and YouTube that are mom related. I've been watching their videos for years now, and I think they are absolutely hilarious, and I'm so glad that they wrote a book. And so I was excited to listen to this one. They narrated themselves, and they did a fantastic job doing it. And so it was wonderful. Some of the parts in it were not as funny as maybe they could have been. And a lot of the stuff in the book was stuff that they've previously talked about in their videos, but I still really enjoyed reading it and getting to know them a little bit better through reading their book. And so I really enjoyed this one. I ended up giving it 4 stars, and I just thought it was great. So after that, I picked up my first ever Sophie Kinsella book. And so I just knew that I wanted something light and fluffy that I didn't really have to think about too much. And so I was looking on my library's audiobook app on my phone and found The Undomestic Goddess by Sophie Kinsella. I did listen to this one in audiobook. It is the story of a high-level lawyer in London who something happens with her job and she ends up kind of running off and finds herself lost in a rural town outside of London. And she goes to the door to ask for a glass of water and maybe to use a phone, and they think that she's there to apply as a housekeeper. And so she knows nothing about keeping house. She doesn't clean her own house. She never cooks. But she just kind of goes along for the ride and decides to pretend that she's a housekeeper and meets some people along the way, and it's just kind of a fun, very lighthearted contemporary. And so it was fun to get through, easy to get through. It was nothing groundbreaking or life-changing, but it was what I needed at the time, which was something light and fluffy. And so I ended up giving that one 3 stars. After reading The Undomestic Goddess, I ended up reading my in real life book club's pick for the month. That was Unbroken by Laura Hillenbrand. And this is the story based on the real life of Louis Zamperini, who was an Olympic track athlete. And then he was in the military. He was a bombardier during World War II, and his plane was shot down. And he survived on a raft in the middle of the Pacific Ocean for 47 days before he was rescued. When he was rescued by the Japanese and transported to a prisoner of war camp in Japan. And it just kind of goes through his experience with that. I had watched the movie prior to reading this, and so I kind of knew what was going on before I got into it. The thing that I liked about the book that the movie doesn't cover is what happens to him after he comes home from the war. And so this book gets into when he gets home from the war, what does he do with his life, and how does the war affect his life moving forward? And I really loved that aspect of the book. This is a powerful, powerful story. And a fun little fact is that I was not aware of. When he was shot down in his plane and he was on the raft with 2 other men. Of the 2 men, one of them ended up passing away on the raft and one of them survived with him. The one that survived with him actually was from the town right next to the town that I grew up in. And so my mom worked in the town. He was a middle school teacher in the town, and my mom was a high school teacher. And so they kind of had similar acquaintances, but he was from that town and I had no idea about that going into it. And so that was really interesting to kind of read about him a little bit, and knowing that that kind of hit a little close to home. So that was really fun. I really, really enjoyed this book. I gave this 5 stars. The audio is narrated by Edward Herman, who plays Lorelai Gilmore's dad, Richard, in The Gilmore Girls, which is one of my favorite TV shows of all time. And he's a well-known actor, but he narrates this on audio, and it was phenomenal. He just has the voice that will just soothe you, and he had the perfect voice for this type of book. And because it is very detailed and military, you know, it talks about a lot of military terms and very factual, and I could listen to him read a phone book probably after this. I've realized that I love his voice, and so I really, really like the audio of this. But the physical book also has pictures and different things in it, and so I would find myself listening to the audio and then picking up the physical book and flipping through it, and just, now I can't find anymore. Oh, there's one. And just looking at the different pictures in the book, so that I could kind of follow along and maybe see how things were pronounced or were spelled, and things like that. And so this was an amazing reading experience. I learned so much about the Pacific aspect of World War II. I was talking with my husband about this, and I feel like in the schools today, in the United States at least, when they talk about World War II, they talk about Pearl Harbor, and they talk about the Holocaust and the European aspect of World War II, but they don't really ever address the Pacific and the Asian part of World War II very much. And so I learned a lot reading this book that I didn't really know before, and I never really thought to ask, and I don't know why. That's not okay, and I don't know why I never thought to ask and to look into it more. But things even as simple as, why did the Japanese attack us during Pearl Harbor? I don't think I had ever really looked into that, and that's explained in this book, and it just opened my eyes to the other aspects of World War II and how it wasn't just a European war, and it wasn't even just Russia, it was a whole Asian aspect of it as well. And so that was really neat. The other thing that they talk about that I had no idea about was how new planes were during World War II, and how because they were such new technology, there were so many deaths related to accidents. There were more deaths related to accidents in the Air Force than there were actual combat deaths in the Air Force during World War II. And I don't think that's something that is talked about. They don't want to recognize that, and understandably so, but it's just something that I never knew, and I found really captivating and interesting, and started looking into the different types of airplanes and how the technology evolved just during the course of the war. And so I thought that was really interesting as well. This is a story of hope. It's a story of strength. It's a story of perseverance, and it's a story of forgiveness in the end. And I absolutely loved it. And now I will stop gushing about it. So that was Unbroken. I obviously gave that 5 stars. It was phenomenal. So after I finished that, I read a graphic novel that I picked up at the library, and that is Snow White by Matt Fillen. Matt Fillen also wrote Bluffton, which I read during middle grade March. This is a retelling of the classic Snow White, but this is set in 1920s New York City. And so it's just a very different take on Snow White. There's not a lot of dialogue in this book. It's mostly illustrations. The illustrations are fantastic. I mean, they're great. It's all black and white pretty much, except for the red apple. So you get that little pop of color, but it's mostly black and white illustrations. I had high hopes for this one, but it didn't really deliver the way I was hoping it would. I was really hoping for something a little bit more in depth than it was. I felt like a lot of the characters weren't really well fleshed out. There wasn't a lot of explanation for how things ended up working out, which, you know, that's something that always bothered me. Well, let me rephrase that. In the fairy tale, you know that the apple is poison, but it's magical and it's a fairy tale. And so when the prince kisses her and she wakes up, that's explanation enough. But in a retelling like this, where it's set during a specific era, where it's not really magic involved, when somebody kisses you and you come back awake after dying, I feel like there needs to be another explanation for it, because other than that, there was no other magic in this book. And so just things like that, I felt like I needed more from it. And so I only ended up giving this one 3 stars. But like I said, I gave it 3 stars because the illustrations were beautiful, and I love Matt Filion's illustrations, but the storytelling just was lacking for me this time around. After I finished that one, I finished reading I'm Just No Good at Rhyming and Other Nonsense for Mischievous Kids and Immature Grown-Ups. And this is by Chris Harris. This was one I had read online, an interview with Neil Patrick Harris, and he was talking about his books, Magical Misfits, which are middle grade books that he writes. And they were asking him about books that he is reading right now with his kids, and he had mentioned this. So I picked it up, and this is a book of poems similar to like Shel Silverstein, that sort of thing, where they're just, some of them are really silly, and some of them are really deep. And so there were some in here that borderline were going to make me cry. And then there were some that I just thought were absolutely hilarious. Like this one, Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by. Since then, I've been completely lost. Thanks for nothing, Robert Frost. I thought that was hilarious. But there's some like that. And then there's one in here that talks about you're tallest when you're 10, and how when you're 10 the world is open and available to you, and then after that you start realizing your limits and your responsibilities, and how things that you say you never do you end up doing, and things you say you'll always do you never do. And that was one that was just eye-opening, and I loved it. And so I just thought that this was absolutely wonderful. I really, really enjoyed it. I gave it 5 stars. I highly recommend it for those who like poetry in, like I said, in the vein of Shel Silverstein, which I think is kind of the bar that everybody sets for children's poetry, him and Jack Perlewski. But this is great. I would highly suggest picking that up. So I finished that one, and then after that, I read One True Loves by Taylor Jenkins Reid. I listened to this one on audiobook. This is the story of Emma, who is out to dinner with her fiance. And while she's out to dinner, she gets a phone call from her husband, who has been missing for 3 years. He was in a helicopter crash 3 years ago, and he went missing. And now apparently he's back. And she has a fiance and has moved on. And so it's just kind of about her emotions, what she went through when she lost her husband, the process she went through to move on from that. And now how does she reconcile her feelings about her husband that she had let go of, and her fiance who she is fallen in love with now, and where do things go from there? And so I thought it was wonderful. I gave it 4 stars. The narration was good. There's a portion of this book that's written in, a small portion, that's written in second person. And so it's you do this and you do that. And it was a little out of place, I think, maybe. But because I was listening to the audiobook, I really feel like that came across a lot better in audio than it might have in a print format. And so I'm really glad that I listened to the audiobook. I thought this was great. It wasn't as good as maybe The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, or I have high hopes still for Daisy Jones. I'm reading that or listening to that right now. But I did still give it 4 stars, and I really had a good time listening to it. After that, I ended up finishing up a book with my kids. This was one that we read during the Lent season, which is a Christian reflection leading up to Easter. So it's the 40 days preceding Easter that we just kind of reflect on the Easter celebration and what it means, and why, kind of preparing our hearts for the Easter celebration. And so leading up to that, my kids and I read together the Jesus Storybook Bible each night. I've had this for over 5 years, and we've never really read through it before. Here and there, like Christmas morning, we'd pull it out and read the Christmas story, but we didn't really read anything else out of it. And so this was our first time reading, and we read through the entire thing, which is the only reason I'm including it as a fully read book, is because I read it cover to cover. And so we loved this book. It is great for anyone looking for something to help their kids understanding Bible stories and how the entire Bible as a whole points to Christ. And so it was wonderful. I gave it 5 stars. We all really enjoyed it. After that, I listened to The Queen of Hearts by Kimmery Martin. This is a story that people say, if you like Grey's Anatomy, you'll love it. And I've been watching Grey's Anatomy for forever, it seems like. I don't know how many seasons there still are, but I'm still watching it. And so this is the story of 2 doctors that are friends that live in Charlotte, and they have been friends since before med school. They were friends all the way through med school, through residency. And now they live in the same town, and they're still best friends. And then they get the shock of their life when they realize that someone from their past is moving to town, and they are not excited about it. And so you get to kind of find out about who that is and why they're not excited and the turmoil that causes. There's discussion in this about the difficulty that doctors have in balancing their work and home life stressors, and how they cope with that. There's talking here about doctors who make mistakes, and they're honest mistakes, and how they're not exempt from human error, and the severity of what those mistakes cause. It was very intriguing. The writer is a doctor herself, and so I think that brought a little bit to the table, because she could relate to being a mom and being a doctor at the same time. And so it was good. I ended up giving it 4 stars. It was interesting. There were a lot of plot twists. Some I saw coming, some I didn't see coming, but I really enjoyed it. And so, like I said, 4 stars. It was good. Also, this came out, I think last year, maybe the year before, and as soon as I saw somebody review it and I saw the cover, I knew I was going to read it because the cover is just so pretty. And so it was good. So those are the 8 books that I read during the month of April. If you've read any of these books, please leave a comment down below. I'd love to chat with you about them. And I hope that you subscribe and stick around. And until next time, see ya!